Hi, everybody, and welcome to another evening of Pop-Up University at Lang Lab from Indiana University, South Bend. Whoa, I'm sorry. I just, I maximized the wrong Zoom window and everything disappeared in front of me. Hey, I'm back. All right. It all looked the same to you, but it looked different to me. Anyway, welcome to another evening. It's great to have you all here, and we have a terrific show tonight. Tonight we have Professor of Health Sciences, Dr. Jennifer Deranek, who's going to talk to us about head trauma. As I've discussed it with her as we were preparing for the show, it sounds like a really moving and thoughtful experience. I know I'm going to learn a lot. And I think we all will. So before we get started with the show, though, I do want to just let everybody know that Pop-Up University is a product of the IU South Bend Community Engagement Office and the IU South Bend Center for Excellence in Research and Scholarship. If you're interested in what you see Professor Deranek talking about tonight, or you want to know more about research at IU South Bend, want to know more about how IUSB can bring students and faculty to bear on your community issues, questions, needs. We have all sorts of ways we can work with you. Feel free to contact Gail McGuire, Director of Community Engagement, or myself, Josh Wells, the Director of the Center for Research. We're glad to talk. And you can find both sites through academics.iusb.edu. We'd also like to thank all of our many sponsors, including Indiana Humanities, the Indiana University Bicentennial Office, and also a great many departments and offices throughout the campus itself. Without their support, Pop-Up University would not be nearly as exciting. So thank you all for your help. And tonight, it is my distinct pleasure to bring you Professor Jennifer Deranek, who she has degrees from Western Michigan University, from Albion College, and from the University of Virginia. Along with being a professor at IUSB, she also is a practicing clinical athletic trainer and has been a program director of Girls on the Run for about half a decade. She works in health promotion, rehabilitation sciences, sports and exercise science, and she is known among our faculty, and especially with our students, as one of the most thoughtful and interesting people you can learn from. She especially given the gravity of the things she'll be discussing tonight, I think her eagerness to share and help is all the more important. And I think we're going to have a really interesting evening. I'll remind everyone, we do have a chat room available in the webinar if you want to ask questions, or if you want to make comments as the show is going on. And certainly Professor Deranek, I think, has several opportunities to do a little back and forth with you in the chat room. So notice where that is as you are getting your popcorn ready. And without further ado, I will stop the screen share here if I don't hide things from myself again. There it goes. And all right, Jenny, are you ready? Then I will be quiet and disappear.
Yeah, give me that professor thing where I try to figure out which PowerPoint I'm going off of here. You guys are going to see my floating head. For those of any of my students who are on, I see Kirsten just messaged in. You guys see this often. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Hopefully this is a good, engaging conversation about the impact of concussions. So I'm sure hope you guys can see what I'm looking at here, see in my PowerPoint. So if you could just let me know that, Josh, that'd be awesome. Thanks so much for that introduction. I think people would describe me as interesting. So that's a good way to start this off.
It looks wonderful, by the way.
Good, I hope so. As you guys can maybe see in the chat a little bit here, Jay and I were going back and forth about being a Brit and representing Albion College. And so as we start off, I want to give a little introduction about who I am, what I bring to the table, what my experience is, and you get to see 4 of me here. A little bit of background is that this first picture here is me as an undergraduate student, an athletic training student, my sophomore year of college, working with the football team as an athletic training student. And so working with teams like I do in all these 3 pictures here represents me as a sports medicine professional. I'm a licensed and certified athletic trainer with a state licensure in Indiana and a national licensure as what my certification is. The middle picture is me all bundled up working college lacrosse, which if you guys have ever seen lacrosse, it's pretty intense and there's lots of concussions that go along with it. And my role over time is kind of transformed into this picture here. This is just me in the fall doing some community-based events as an athletic trainer and representing IUSB. Athletic trainers are licensed healthcare professionals who are responsible for prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, and overall care of illnesses and injuries for an athletic population. So you guys have probably seen us if you've watched any sporting event before where somebody gets hurt. Some people usually run on the field and take care of that athlete. And that is what an athletic trainer is. Athletic trainers are also in a lot of different industries. They're in physical therapy clinics, they're in our factories, they're in hospital settings, they're kind of all over. And it's this behind the scenes profession that you may not have really heard of or know much about. But yes, Jay, I see that. Albion definitely does have national football, and I can get you free tickets if you want. So that's a little bit about my background, I think kind of establishing and grounding me in this conversation today as we lead into talking about concussions. My first experience with a concussion, beyond just being educated about the concussion, happened that sophomore year around that time of this first picture here of what an athlete, a football player who got a concussion. The athlete walked across, it was right about halftime that he got the concussion. He was a wide receiver. And I vividly still, this has been a really long time ago, remember the athlete walking up and down the sideline saying, "Is it homecoming? Are we winning? When did I get hurt? Was I playing? Are we winning? What's happening? Is it homecoming?" And repeated the conversation over and over and over again and walked up to anybody who would listen and was asking the same exact questions. And we know that a concussion is this temporary loss of cognitive function, physical function, and emotional symptoms can be brought on with a concussion and a head injury. In this next slide, I'm going to describe what a concussion is. So bear with me because there's a lot of information on this slide. Let me scooch myself over. I'm trying to mirror actual pop-up here by floating around. So a concussion is a pathophysiologic process that is the result of biomechanical forces. These forces can be to the head, the neck, the face, or any other area of the body that's going to cause jolting of the brain. So the brain itself sits inside the cranium and sits inside of our skull, and there's very fine space in between the two. Now, if there's some sort of impact that happens, the brain is going to push up against that cranium and inside of that skull, which can lead to damage. Now, the damage could be, or the impact could be where someone gets hit. So let's say we're talking football, as I've been mentioning that. If someone goes head to head and has a head-to-head collision, the damage could be at the front of the head, or it could be at the back, which is called a contracture injury or a contracture concussion. Concussions are typically going to result in rapid onset, short-term impairment. Now, these functions are usually going to resolve spontaneously, but we're going to talk about later in this discussion about how some of these onset of symptoms can come like 3 weeks after the fact, after an actual injury or some sort of blunt force trauma. They're typically going to result in some sort of functional disturbance rather than a structural injury, meaning people are still typically able to function with a head injury like this, or a traumatic brain injury is really what we should be calling these. So they can function typically fine. You can't see that injury in the brain, but they're going to have functional disturbances. So we're going to talk about some of the symptoms like balance issues and headaches. And this is a common misnomer in I think the experience of people with concussions is that people can have concussions with or without a loss of consciousness. In fact, it's more common for people to have no loss of consciousness with a concussion versus being, what we refer to as being knocked out. The other thing about concussions, and I'm going to again show some pictures of it a little bit later on, is that standard imaging doesn't demonstrate a concussion. So oftentimes when the general population gets some sort of head injury, maybe they go to the ER. We'll talk about that too. Maybe they go to the ER and they get an MRI or a CT scan to try to reveal some imaging, and it's not going to reveal the structural changes that are actually happening within the brain. So I'm going to ask for my first aspect of involvement from you guys here, and I'm asking you if you can share with me what you know about concussions and who it might impact and how they might be impacted. For example, I just gave the example of, football, or that head-to-head injury with football. Yet there's so many different examples. So I'm not asking you to reveal anything about your past history or, identify anybody. But if you want to chat in some ideas of how concussions can happen, I'd love for that to just kind of spark some conversation and be creative. So yeah, good. So good. Executive cognitive functioning. Sharon, we're going to talk about that. Car accidents is a huge one, especially as we talk about the adult population. Car accidents is the third leading cause of concussions. Falls. Oh, good. Gosh, Carmen, I'm so glad that you have no experiences with it. Boxing, absolutely. Boxing is huge. Soccer. Youth soccer is actually one of the most common ways that youth have head injuries. And so if you have kids or something that are involved in youth soccer, you've probably seen that you can, sorry, I'm catching the chat. It just distracted me. Brenda's just distracted me. That they've made some accommodations for how kids can be hitting the ball with their head or heading the ball. Brenda's distracted me because it was bent over in the dark and hit your face on an oak table. Yes, accidents, right? Bicycling, loss of consciousness and falling to the, yes, you guys rock. This is awesome. Thank you for this. This is carrying laundry to the basement. Gosh, isn't that such a concern for people who maybe live alone or anything like that? Yeah, so good. Someone asked, can you just get it from being shaken up? Absolutely. This is where the impact of youth really comes into play, and how this aspect of concussions is across the lifespan. It's totally a public health concern because it starts early on and it can continue. Mallory, I see that you add in construction workers dropping tools. Yes. Workplace injuries we're going to talk about. Yes, you guys are so awesome. Some of the other ones that I have that I didn't quite see come up would be like equestrian. I mean, you can get hit with a tennis racket accidentally if you're playing doubles, playing tennis. Kids falling off of trampolines. A rough roller coaster probably could, depending on a person's structural ability and their ability to control themselves. So I typically avoid roller coasters. That's not usually why, though. So you guys have done an awesome job setting the stage for how these can happen. And it's pretty easy, right? You guys are naming a lot of them. But what I want to just share with you guys is the incidence of reporting these. The CDC identifies concussions as being a silent epidemic. There's 30 to 50% of concussions that are actually unreported. So the estimation for the number of concussions annually is 300,000 to 3.8 million. And that is like an unreal difference between the two, right? So why do you think that is? Let's keep this engagement going. Why do you think that is, that we have so many that are unreported? Still, that rough roller coaster is the one that is the aspect of the chat here. Yeah, so good. Unaware is a huge thing. Players don't want to miss games. Parents don't want kids to miss games, right? Yes, love this. Jay, thank you for sharing that about the ringing of the bell. In fact, I had a little bell picture in here, but I thought somebody would say it. Maybe you think back to yourself as a youth athlete, or you are a youth athlete, and you get your bell rung, right? You hear of that terminology, or even, I'm going back to what Brenda shared about hitting your head, and that, like, oh man, kind of just shook me up a little bit here. You're right, you guys, people are not always as aware what a concussion means, what it can look like, and what the symptoms are. Not worth the time to go to the ER? Absolutely. Which brings into question, how do you actually manage this? How do we know? And then what is the impact? People can't see it. They can't put a cast on their head. It's an invisible injury. It's an invisible epidemic. And that causes a whole lot of issues when it comes to academic preparation, workforce preparation. And again, we are going to really, we're going to really talk about this. Yes, I like this idea of ignorance. Yeah, absolutely. My hair's messy. There we go. Yeah, so this idea of not quite understanding it is a really, really powerful thing, because as we talk about this being a public health issue, in youth in particular is where this starts. It starts with just maybe shaking a baby and not realizing it, bouncing a baby up and down on your leg and not realizing what that's doing. I have 2 boys and they are very, very rough. And I would have no doubt that one of them has had a concussion, yet I just haven't heard them report the symptoms. And I'm an educated person on this. And so we think about the unreporting of this, the lack of desire to go get medical care, the need for continuing academics. You can't see it. So is it really happening? Those factors are all huge when it comes to people reporting concussions, yet it's a huge concern. Now I'm going to test your cognitive ability a little bit here, and I'm going to give you 5 words. They're going to come back in a little bit. So I'm going to give you 5 words. I want you to remember these 5 words. Don't cheat and don't write them down though. Okay, you guys. So baby, monkey, perfume, sunset, and iron. Now, one more time, I'm going to give you 5 words, and I'd like for you to remember these words. They're going to come back up later on. Baby, monkey, perfume, sunset, and iron. That's your little tease for now. No writing it down, no cheating on that. Now, let's talk about some of these symptoms. I know I'm blocking off half of it and it's okay. Let's talk about this side that I'm not blocking, about symptoms of a concussion. You hit your head, you fall, you get into a car accident. What does it look like? What does it mean? The challenging thing about all of these symptoms is that if I get a concussion today, tonight, and then I get a concussion 6 months from now, the symptoms could be different. My symptoms might be different than your symptoms. And so this makes it hard for people to be able to identify the effect of the symptoms. So headache, nausea, vomiting, blurred vision, and I also add with blurred vision, things like double vision, pupil dilation, either dilation or constriction, pupil different sizes, tinnitus is ringing in the ears, fatigue, confusion, mental fogginess. And then I like all these difficulties down here. So another consideration with concussions is not just how we present. We may present differently than other people. They may present as things that you're just not aware of. I mentioned before that a concussion symptoms could happen 3 weeks after the fact, after an actual injury. And so now, Carmen, that's exactly where I'm going to go with this, right? In this aspect of COVID in this world that we're in, mental fogginess, difficulty focusing, concentrating, and remembering, like, I feel like that's me on a daily basis. And I'm saying this as my bosses are on this, and this is being recorded. This is true, right? Or fatigue, general fatigue. I mean, your kids could be up during the night, or you just worked hard or worked late. Headache could be a result of dehydration or poor nutrition or lack of exercise. And so this is part of the challenge of why it's so hard to identify these symptoms. Now, let me scooch myself over and talk about this side, the other side. So balance, loss of consciousnness. I'm going to show you some examples of how we test balance. Loss of consciousness, I mentioned that before. Sleep dysregulation. Oh, good question, Tina. I see that come in. How would you tell of a baby falling off the bed? So especially when it comes to youth who are unable to verbalize, their pain, it would be erratic behavior or unusual behavior, lots of crying, maybe grabbing at the head if they're aware of that. Also eye movement. There's something called nystagmus that can happen where there's rapid eye movement, pupil dilation. Those are the things that would indicate it in someone who's unable to verbalize, yet those things might not be present. So I would really base it off of behavior. Sleep dysregulation is a huge thing when it comes to concussions. So I think often the misnomer I'm going to say about concussion treatment is that you shouldn't let people sleep if they have a concussion, but people who have concussions are tired, yet their sleep patterns are often really, really off because they're just unable to calm themselves down, focus, and their brain isn't able to function normally, which again, we know this is a brain injury. So situational stress, and then these are really valuable things for us to consider as we're talking about this idea of this being a public health crisis, something we really need to focus in on. Identity loss. I'm gonna skip reaction time for a second. Anxiety, increased depression, and affect change. So if someone all of a sudden is down or crying more than normal, or doesn't have any depressive symptoms before an injury happens, and then within 3 weeks or so starts to develop an aspect of depression. Depression occurs within 11 to 23% of concussions. Yet it's hard to identify that back, right? Think about what's happening with COVID and the anxiety and the depression and what's caused with that. And so it's hard to identify. I like talking about the example of decreased reaction time is my own experiences with a concussion, as I was a weekend warrior playing soccer as an adult, and I got my feet taken out from under me and my head slammed down on the ground, and I got up and I was dazed and I was blurry, got myself off the field. I was by myself, so I drove home. It was about a 20-minute trip home, and I got home and realized, like, man, I should not have done that. That was a terrible thing. And of course, I'm educated, so I know what this means. There's a decreased reaction time after people have concussions. In fact, it's like 26 milliseconds of reaction time on average, which doesn't seem like much. But when you're driving a motor vehicle, or you're operating some sort of heavy machinery, or you are, Kirsten, that pretty much ended my soccer career. The soccer career ended way before that. That's just my desire to, I don't know, be crazy. But where was it going? Oh, so 26 milliseconds, that can make a huge difference when it comes to reaction time of taking care of children or whatever a workplace type need would be. So again, if someone has a concussion, they say they're on their second concussion, their symptoms may be totally different the second time than it is their first time, which makes it really hard to identify. And also from the public health standpoint, the treatment might not be the same. The way the body responds might not be the same. Let's talk a little bit about the diagnosis and what it actually looks like. So let me scooch myself out of the way again. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna scooch myself out there. It makes it really hard for us to be able to identify and quantify and classify a concussion because not everybody has access to imaging in order to be able to see this. This picture here is an example of someone who's 19 hours post a fall, I think a fall off of a ladder. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, there's a scalp contusion or a cut on the head. There's a detachment of a fluid around the meninges. And we know that within 30 minutes of a concussion happening, there's cell death. There's neurologic, and there's neurons dying and cells dying in that area. I'm not going to get too scientific here for this talk, but that's impactful. Then what happens, because our bodies are just incredible machines, is that we have this thing called microglia, which are these like phagocytic cells that are like Pac-Man that come to the area to try to get rid of those dead cells. And what that does is then cause scarring and excess tissue in that area. And so if that continues to build up over time, or we keep having repetitive blows to the head, that's going to create damage to the brain, which I think it makes sense that I don't need to explain to you guys that damage to the brain is not a very good thing, right? It can cause all kinds of issues. And we're going to talk about the impact of these on various components of work and academics. So in my world in athletics, the kind of the rule of the thumb here is about 3 concussions. 3 concussions and you're done. Now, this is hard. This is what makes it foggy. And I hope you guys see this, that as we're talking about all of this in the chat about like a baby falling off of a bed, could that be a concussion? Absolutely. Could a teenager or a youth have a concussion from being involved in a car accident with their family? Absolutely. Then they get to high school and they play football, another concussion. And then they enroll in the military, like this picture here, another concussion. Without the proper diagnosis and the proper tracking and the proper treatment of these concussions, it becomes a true crisis for long-term health. And that's truly the issue here. Some other considerations with concussions would be things like second impact syndrome. Second impact syndrome is when someone has a concussion And this is where, someone has a concussion and then they don't get treatment for it, or they don't tell anybody. And then let's say that youth goes back and plays hockey with a concussion. There's already trauma to the brain, and then they get hit again. And that is likely to cause extreme damage and also long-term deficits, and really damaging to health. So that's where, again, this idea of reporting is really, really important. And then with youth, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. With youth especially, that's where the education component really comes into play for how valuable this is. And I'm even going to push like educating parents about how valuable this is and why we need to be having this conversation. So Nanny just asked if concussions can lead to mental health problems. Absolutely. So we mentioned about there being anxiety, depression, and I'm going to talk in a little bit about some links to some other neurological diseases and ADHD. So let me keep rocking and rolling here. Oh, let me scooch myself out of the way. So this is an example of what somebody would look like if they're going through some sort of concussive episode. And so I want to talk about the impact of these, right? So I've been mentioning it all along, but what is the true impact? What is the problem? How do we define this? I mentioned that concussions, the impact of concussions goes away, right? We get hit, something happens, we wait our times, kind of like having the COVID vaccine. We deal with our symptoms, we move on, hopefully. And yet we know there's a strong link when there is this traumatic brain injury to impacting a variety of things, specifically academics. So what I didn't ask you guys to start off with is just like where your involvement is with academics. However, whether you're involved with the university, you're a professor, or you have high school age kids or youth or whatever, somebody who's involved in school are going to be at some point. Look at the statistic in this range. 27 to 90% of people with concussions have academic challenges. Like that is, again, a huge difference. And I think I've explained that we see maybe why this is the case, that one concussion might be different than the way the other concussion is, or a person might be in a different life situation when they are experiencing these academic challenges or not. Academic accommodations when it comes to someone with a concussion is really important. So this is the idea of return to learn. Return to learn criteria still isn't very clear because of the fogginess, this challenge of how concussions are actually presented. So people who have a concussion, and let me back up and just say, like, I talk a lot about athletics because that's my realm, but concussions, especially as we're talking about people in an academic setting, could be car accidents, it could be work accidents, it could be really any of these things that we've identified in the chat. So it doesn't have to be just student athletes, although a lot of colleges and universities have return to learn criteria for student athletes. And that doesn't always get translated to the rest of the general population, which I think is a huge concern. So people who are post-concussion have difficulty focusing. Someone mentioned earlier, I can't remember who it was, this idea of executive function challenges. So the idea of task management, planning things out, understanding time ability, executive function. People who are also, again, trying to study have true poor performance. This is demonstrated poor performance. It might not last a long time, but post-concussion, they could have that poor performance. Symptom exacerbation. Simple things for many people, like speaking of like high school or junior high age, walking in between classes when the bell rings. The sound of the bell ringing can exacerbate symptoms. And the thought as far as treatment goes is that keep the symptoms down. Avoid doing things that cause symptoms. Avoid bright lights, avoid bright sounds, avoid things that are going to make you nauseous, make your headache get worse. Yet there's such a push and a need for academics. So cognitive rest is a really important thing. Cognitive rest would mean things, especially for today's academic person, would be like no texting, no computer, not watching videos, not YouTubing or TikToking or whatever, Snapchatting everybody. But that can often be a challenging thing when we're trying to keep up with academics. So symptom resolution oftentimes can take about a month. And the recommendation, especially from the NCAA, is accommodations for 1 to 3 weeks. That's almost like a fourth of the semester, right? That can be really significant. This next slide here, This next slide here has an example, some examples. This is from McGrath. Let me move myself. There's McGrath. You can see my citation. I took this right from the article because I thought this was just an incredible way to summarize and provide examples of some things that can be done for people recovering from concussions. Again, this is specific for student athletes, but it can be generalized for the population. So excused absences from class, extended testing time, monitoring backpack weight. Wow, like, gosh, I remember being in high school and having so many things in my backpack, and still today. The use of people to help take notes. Denise, I'm just reading yours. Yeah, so accommodation's good. I like that point. This is a huge challenge because accommodations can take a really, really long time. Yet, systemically, we have the ability to help influence some of these changes to say, this isn't right, this isn't okay. And especially at the higher ed level, and I know from my experience and working with other colleagues that some people are really willing to make accommodations for somebody and other people are not, especially as you guys have identified here in the chat, that it's an invisible injury. Someone comes in and they broke their wrist doing who knows what, and they can't type or they can't write. There's accommodations in place, right? That's a pretty easy thing to do. Or you see someone visibly on crutches, crutching into your classroom, trying to, get from here or there. No problem. You leave 5 minutes early so you don't get caught up in the hallways. But what about somebody who closes their car door or walks into the building and we haven't seen, so don't play wind instrument, but others okay. Why? Yeah, because of pressure in the head. So Nanny just asked about playing wind instrument, but like something that doesn't cause pressure. So playing a wind instrument increases intrathecal pressure, which challenges the amount of pressure that's going out throughout the whole body. And so that can exacerbate symptoms by playing something like that. But like you play like the violin or something like that, that's not as much change of pressure gradient within the body itself. So my point to you guys when we're talking about this with academics is really to challenge and think about how we are viewing it as this silent injury, this silent illness, this silent epidemic, as the CDC calls it. The next thing I want to talk about is work impact. So you guys mentioned some of this, but 24% of traumatic brain injuries, remember I said that's what we should be calling concussions, are work related. That's a pretty significant number. Now, the number one cause for adults would be falls, slips, or trips, right? Slipping on ice. The second thing would be being struck by some sort of object. And the third thing is motor vehicle accidents, which you guys mentioned that already. Now, I think just similar to what we were talking about with academics is that you can't see this. So it's hard to prove. People aren't getting medical care for it. So it's hard to prove and it's hard to get accommodations. And you think of someone who, I can't imagine taking time off of work with a concussion because I don't know if it's just dedication or just stupidity maybe, but we have that investment into our work, right? A lot of people do. And a need for money. So having an invisible injury is often challenging to prove, challenging to get workman's compensation unless it's or any sort of compensation, unless it's a drastic type injury. There's research that demonstrates that education levels and age are actually impacted in the workforce. People with a higher education level are actually more likely to leave their job because of a concussion than people with a lower education level. And the reason is that cognitive function, that executive function that's necessary for a lot of jobs that people have when their education level increases. Additionally, lower education level, they might be working more of a non-salary and hourly position where they have to have and really depend on that type of money. The other thing to consider when it comes to workforce is this idea of safety. So if I slip and fall outside of a building or let's say outside of my house, I'm probably going to walk around that area that I slipped and fell in. Or if I'm working in a factory and I'm climbing up a ladder and the floor is really grimy, the place isn't taking workplace safety well, and my ladder slips and I fall off the ladder and have a head injury, I'm going to be pretty skeptical about the safety considerations. It's actually like a traumatic experience for a lot of people to step back into a workplace or some sort of environment, even an athletic population, when they are following a concussion. I don't want to have this happen again. And it happened in a place where I thought I was safe. a place where I thought I was comforted. Okay, I'm going to break this up for a second, and I'm going to give you now another one of these cognitive teasers. And one of the things that we do with concussion testing, what we do right now is called a SCAT-5 test, is ask people to do some of these cognitive things. So I mentioned my 5 words earlier. Maybe this is your little ploy to think about it. But what I want you to do right now to yourself or in your head or out loud or whatever your space is take the months of the year and say them backwards. Think about the months of the year and say them backwards. So starting with December. December, I'm gonna give you the space to do this. I can't see any thumbs up because I can't see any of you guys. That was my plan, is to have you give me a little thumbs up when you got that. Now think about when you're trying to think about the months of the year backwards, you got to kind of think a little bit, right? It's easier if we were to say, okay, start at January, February, March. My 4-year-old can do that. But if I were to ask him to say them backwards, that challenges his brain's cognitive ability to actually think through and process this as a question. And if you have someone who has this traumatic brain injury or damage to, thanks Jay, damage to the brain, that's going to be challenging for them to do. There's a whole bunch of other different types of cognitive tests that we can do. Things that we can ask for short-term memory and long-term memory. Like, what day is it today? What field are we at? What sport are you playing? Where are you at your workplace? And if you know that person, you can ask things that are like, what college did you attend? If you know, or maybe in a work setting, you can ask things that are more about their past if you know the examples to that. And again, that's kind of where that 5 words come into play. Now, as we mentioned, so we talked about the academic impact, we talk about the workforce impact. I want to talk a little bit about the public, the long-term impact, which I truly view this as the public health concern. We know that post-concussion, there's damage in the lobes where it's going to incur. There's damage in the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the hippocampus, and that could be as simple from one concussion. We generally classify concussions as mild, moderate, and severe based off of the range of symptoms that someone has, as well as the sustainability of how long a concussion actually lasts. But this is where my opinion is that this is where the fog starts to clear a little bit, and we see how important concussion management, concussion awareness actually is. So the first thing here is talking about neuromuscular control. This is a common test that we do with concussed individuals, actually people so we get a baseline test. This is called the BEST test. So I encourage you to try it if you want. You put your hands on your hips, put your feet together, then you stand on your non-dominant foot, and then you stand in a tandem stance, which would be C and F there, with your dominant foot in front. Close your eyes, and then you can also like stand on a pillow and do something like that to challenge your balance a little bit more. Now, I mentioned that balance is an issue with concussions. So there's the altered balance, the altered equilibrium that comes from concussions. Now, if this is sustained or happens repeatedly over time, this can really alter a person's mechanics, their biomechanics. So their gait or their walk can actually adapt while they are in this concussed state or even post-concussion, because the body is just fascinating with the way the nervous system controls and protects itself. Now, I already mentioned and talked about this inability to react, but what it also does is can lead to an increased risk of lower extremity musculoskeletal injury. So that's just fancy words for like knee injuries or hip injuries or ankle injuries, because the body's trying to protect itself. The body's trying really, really hard to maintain balance and maintain gait. Yeah, I hope so, Carmen. I should try to stand on mine. Now, where this can become a really big issue is the link to chronic disability and joint degeneration. When we have an alteration of our mechanics, the way that we're walking, the way that we're moving, that causes a joint, a typical joint like the knee, this would be like the knee joint, to break down, to actually wear down, which can lead to knee replacements, it can lead to meniscus injuries, and then that stems into this idea of public health, which leads to increased medical costs, needs for missing work, mental health concerns that come with that whole aspect of surgery and change. That's a problem when it comes to neuromuscular control. The next thing I want to talk about is this slide here. And I'm actually going to read this slide. I'm going to make myself, well, I'm good. I'm actually going to read this slide because this is really, really valuable. This is newer data from 2020. This was a retrospective population-based cohort study that regardless of age, sex, socioeconomic status, and residence, having suffered a single concussion in one's lifetime increases the likelihood of later being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, dementia, ADHD, mood and anxiety disorders. And then we know that when concussions are compounded, when there's more than one concussion throughout a lifetime, it increases the risk even more. This is unbelievable. And we've been working really hard. We as in research has been working really hard to identify this and to try to find some sort of link. I think it's been known. I think it's been there. It's just a matter of having this prospective study. This cohort study was a huge study that was done. Also, yeah, I mean, there's so many effects of this. The other thing I have mentioned in here that isn't listening too much is no, your mother might not have been kidding when she said your brother was dropped two-headed. I have two of those brothers. I hope they're not listening. Linking with Alzheimer's, there often with concussions, there's a thinning of the cortex. And then also with Alzheimer's, there's a buildup of plaque, which we're going to talk about that in relation to the idea of CTE and what that means and looks like. So this, to me, everyone who's listening, is like huge. This is why we need to be concerned about concussions in youth. Yet it's hard to tell someone who's really working hard to get their youth athlete or their equestrian athlete, or they're trying to keep their job or whatever, that this could be something that impacts them. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone is going to have these, but these numbers are pretty staggering, and there's lots of links to altered neurocognitive function down the road. The other thing I want to mention here is this idea of CTE, because this is something that's been common. I think we've heard a little bit more about, if you care anything about athletics like I do. So CTE is this neurodegenerative disease. You can see this picture here of what a normal 27-year-old brain looks like. And then the picture on the right is Aaron Hernandez, which this is a picture. Oh, let me go backwards here. This is Aaron Hernandez. He has since deceased. Obviously, they have his brain. He's a football player, 27 years old. CTE often comes with a lot of mood behaviors, a lot of erratic behavior, depression, paranoia, anxiety, anger. And I like this example because Aaron Hernandez was really big in media because he was a really popular football player and then was involved in a murder trial, went to jail, lost his life in jail, and they were able then to use his brain to be able to identify this aspect of CTE. So with CTE is repetitive trauma over and over and over again that causes this abnormal protein development. And the other thing that you may have heard of this, heard in the news, that there are like post-NFL players who have been retired who are taking their own lives because they know something's not right. And they're doing it through activities that don't involve damaging their brain so that their brain can be used for research because they want to be able to prove this. Now, I'm going to defend football and that we've come a long way when it comes to rules and the padding in helmets. I mean, the technology that goes into that would just blow your mind. But still, it's repetitive head trauma, and it starts in youth. It starts at a really early age. So let me go back to my 5 words. I think if you can repeat them to yourselves now, think about it. Maybe you get a little thumbs up or something for me. What are those 5 words? Close, but not quite. The 5 words that I gave you in the beginning were baby, monkey, perfume, sunset, and iron. Good. Jen Happel was close. Baby, monkey, perfume, sunset, and iron. This is an example of something that we would do to test someone's cognitive function, to test their memory recall. So in a conversation with someone who has suspected concussion, I would give them these words to remember. And then towards the end of our conversation, I would re-ask them the words. And then later, I would re-ask the words, right? So I think every healthcare professional who deals with people who have concussions or the likelihood of concussions has their set of words that we use to remember and use to ask. But it's a really powerful thing. Yeah, 3 out of 5, 80%, good job. Now, as we round out my time here, I really just want to share that my hope for this conversation. My hope is that you're listening to this and you're understanding more about the need to properly treat diagnose, report, recognize, support, and I'm going to add the word respect concussions. Now, this 2020 data is pretty staggering about the impact of concussions and what they can have long term. And then also the impact on what it can have for academics, for workforce, for just general mood effect, anxiety, depression, mood changes that impacts family dynamics and social situations. It has a socioeconomic impact. This is public health. So my hope for you as we, round out here is talking just really about how valuable it is to take this information and this knowledge forward. And when you hear someone say like, oh, I got a little lightheaded, or I got my bell rung, but I'm going to get back out there and I'm going to do my thing and I can't afford to miss X, Y, and Z. You can. We can, if we support each other and we continue to have structures in place like return to learn procedures, return to work procedures that help support this invisible injury, because otherwise it's going to continue to remain foggy of what the control is. And then I think the other thing I really just want to share too is that a lot of people think that like, I had a concussion, this isn't going to happen to me, right? I'm not going to have this happen. My kid is really, really good at football, or I'm knocking on football a lot, or soccer or whatever. And it's not going to happen to them. And so I have found this example of a local athlete from Wabash College who killed himself, took his own life. And that day had Googled or researched what CTE was. Called 911 3 times trying to reach out for support and for help. And I get goosebumps saying this. This is in 2018. And, if you know this person in this family, I'm sorry if this brings up any trauma for you, but it can happen. It can happen. CTE is a really extreme version of what happens with repetitive trauma, but it can happen, and we can have this effect and then link back to what happened in youth over time. So more knowledge is power. The last thing I have for you guys here is just 2 slides of my ridiculous number of references, and finished up in time to hopefully be able to help answer some questions, get some guidance. I do want to share that I didn't add any information really about the actual treatment and diagnosis of a concussion, because you have to be a specialized individual to really go through that. And so, yeah, I'm happy to have that conversation about what that looks like, but it continues to adapt and develop over time. So thank you guys very much for your time. I look forward to any sort of questions that you have in the chat here. And I welcome anything. Go athletic training. Okay, so Kristen's asking if older generations are more likely to develop cognitive issues than our generations. Yeah, I think so, because of developments, especially as we're talking about football. That's been a really common thing. Boxing, is kind of moving out of popularity, and that was a really big thing at one point in our world and in our life. I think kids are still not playing outside. That's a whole nother conversation we could have about the impact of video games on brain health. But yeah, I do think that's the case. Yeah, Brenda, I'd be happy to talk about post-concussion syndrome. Yeah, why it happens, why it seems worse than the original concussion mine did. Yeah. So I think some of not judging you for maybe not treating yourself well, but post-concussion syndrome can come when the symptoms aren't treated well, right? You're not really respecting the process of the concussion and what's needed, and also doing things too early. So the newest data and the newest research when it comes to treatment of concussions is, well, it used to be rest, total rest. Now, there's a lot more research, and what we're doing with Beacon Health System is actually activity, right? So submaximal activity that doesn't increase any sort of symptoms. That makes sense because it helps get blood flowing, it helps bring the blood to the area to help create healing and establish and stimulate healing. And that hasn't always been the thought. So that would be, oh, good. So I'm glad I got you, Brenda, about not taking care of yourself. Yeah, so there's lots of that. I'm looking through here. Sorry guys, if I'm missing you. I'm happy. I have my email here and also my Twitter if you want to reach out to me too. Are healthcare providers not doing enough to root out concussion history? I would say that people are not being honest enough about their concussion history. So I think that we have the ability, we have the choice to, as individuals, to be honest about what our history is, or parents filling out forms. But I think that's kind of the chicken or the egg. That's a hard thing. I think there's so many questions, especially as I think about physicals that we ask that don't involve as much about concussions. Okay, so sorry, I'm trying to keep up here. Thank you for that. Yeah, the public health. What type of activity doesn't cause symptoms? Yeah, Susie, that's a great question. It's totally subjective to the person. For some people, it could be as simple as like laying down causes symptoms. For some people, it could be running doesn't cause symptoms, but walking or running does, but walking doesn't. So it's dependent on the person, which also makes it hard to classify this. Someone asked about IU having a policy regarding the head trauma, and maybe someone from IU who could respond to that. I actually Googled IUSB and concussions, and the first thing that came up was my talk, which I'm grateful for, yet the first thing that should come up is care for it. I also found our student athlete policy on the website, but I didn't find anything directly related to the general student population. What would be acceptable high school activity of high school, someone involved for a concussion? Does that information come from the parent or the school nurse? Oh, man. I hope that school has an athletic trainer, number one. And number two, I'd say that should come from a combination of the physician, right, seeking medical care, and involvement of the parent and the nurse. So Indiana in general, especially the Indiana High School Athletic Association has really tightened down for concussion care. I'm a member of our Indiana Athletic Training Board where we're involved in a lot of this legislation. But it's still foggy, right? Goes back to the topic of this. It's still pretty foggy. Can academic challenges show up 6 months to a year after concussion? Absolutely, 100%. No doubt about that. I mean, I have stories that I could share about that, about student athletes who have had to drop out of college because of mild concussions that have post-concussion syndrome. Okay, so sorry guys, if I'm missing you, please, I don't mean to intentionally. Noticing a student may be demonstrating some of these cognitive challenges and need support services. So at IU South Bend, it would be, I think, a conversation about what their challenges might be, and then referral to disability support services. My understanding is that disability support services at IU South Bend is what takes care and helps with those accommodations. Yet I'll be honest, as a faculty member, I don't know if there's enough education that comes with that for what that means for accommodations, right? Again, that idea of returning to learn. So Sharon, I would say that a conversation with them, and if they're not willing to accept that suggestion, then document it, inform the proper people, and continue to offer as much grace and kindness and compassion as you can. So Jaren's asking if people are notified if a concussion happens with a student athlete. So that's actually either a HIPAA or a FERPA violation if they're sharing what is exactly happening. My understanding is that they can just share what kind of accommodations need to come along with that, and not necessarily that it's a concussion. Yet, it's wraparound services. It's the idea of multiple people helping and supporting an individual through this. So yeah, it depends. We obtain baseline data on our student athletes. Do you have a comparison? Yeah, so there's lots of baseline data that you can do. There's computer-based testing that can be done. Impact testing is one of the most common ones. And then there's also a lot of balance testing, like that picture that I showed you, that helps to determine a lot of baseline data. So baseline data is collected. Yet again, when we talk about an athletic population, if we're talking about a high school, which is a really big issue when it comes to youth concussions, and this idea of this being this public health concern, there's one athletic trainer or no athletic trainer for X number of athletes. And so oftentimes the baseline testing can be really hard to do and gets prioritized to sports that are going to have more direct contact. Carolyn sharing about post-concussion syndrome. I mean, it's just intense. It's intense. Given the estimated number of concussions, seems over a lifetime. Yeah, so if so, how are the extreme numbers you reference obtained? 78% increased risk. So those numbers, I don't know who asked this, I can't see, but those numbers were based off of a retrospective study that was done. I'm happy to share that one with you. where they analyzed thousands of people and their ICD-9 codes when they came into the hospital, and then followed up post-concussion. So that's how that information was generated. How often would I say I have to address a concussed athlete when I'm working a game? Depends on the sport. It depends on the sport that I'm working. So even things like, I recently worked a Division II swim meet over at the beautiful Elkhart Beacon. And one of the concerns with that would be diving. You think about diving off of the high dive, the amount of force and impact that comes from hitting someone's head on the, if they don't have their self established right, hitting against the water, that could cause a concussion. So I don't know. I mean, I have dealt with countless concussions, helped manage, I should say, not dealt with, helped manage countless concussions. And so it really depends on the sport. I spent a lot of time working football and a lot of time working college lacrosse, and experienced athletes, I mean, I'd say probably weekly with concussions. Cool. Swam once with someone who got a concussion. Oh yeah. Yes, it's intense. Swimming's intense. Yeah. So the flip turn, so actually being underwater, missing the turn and hitting their head against the wall. And that's where these things can happen anywhere, anytime, any sport, anything. So that was Lexi, that brings back to mind whoever asked the question about, is there baseline data? Are swimmers generally baseline tested for concussions? No. Are divers? Yeah, because they're more likely to have it happen. Yet, the baseline data typically isn't there. It depends on manpower, it depends on woman power. It depends on the ability for the medical providers to be able to provide and do that baseline data. Yeah, it is amazing how underestimated the numbers are. Sorry if I'm missing anything. Josh, feel free to fill me in if I'm missing. But again, I'm welcome. Please email me, please tweet me, or check out the information that we just did last Friday on Twitter for the SOTL Twitter conference. That's all up there. I'm happy to keep the conversation going at any point in time, but I know there's kind of some wrap ups. Oh, Gail, don't put me on the spot there. No, my children are not allowed to play football when they get older. And my father-in-law, if he's watching, was very upset about that. But no, there's too much data. I've seen it, not just about concussions, but about, the rest of the injuries that can happen. I got stories for days, but they can be wrapped up in a little bubble. If that's fine with me. Thank you. Thank you everybody for joining. Josh, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share of the screen. I think I can do that so that you can tap in.
Yep, and here we are. Well, thank you so much, Jenny. This was I told you when we were talking about the show beforehand that you were going to blow my mind, and you did. This is so much.
Hopefully not to lead to a concussion, though. So that's.
Well, I've had enough car wrecks. That was my problem, and heading soccer balls. But I'll protect my neck from now on. Before we go, I do want to remind everybody, let's see if I can do this right. I just want to remind everybody, next month, May 20th, Kim McInerney, the director the director of our public speaking program, is going to talk about Impeach the Media, how to be a critical media consumer in the age of fake news. I'm sure that will resonate with everybody and be a pretty exciting talk, as they all are. And we hope to see you in May, and remind you all, go.iu.edu/popup. You can find Jenny's video in a couple of days, plus all the videos from our previous speakers. Professor Deranek, thank you so much. This has been terrific, and thank you all for coming. And we hope to see you next month.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.